Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Critical Fools podcast. This is episode 27, and this week we will be reviewing the newest film I think we've reviewed in our current, out of all the films that we've reviewed. It's a 2020 film called Possessor, directed by Brandon Cronenberg. This is the son, I believe, of a pretty famous director by the name of David Cronenberg. And this being his first film, so I was actually fairly impressed. I wondered if I could get your initial thoughts on the film, Chris, and then we'll give a little bit of a plot summary.
Yeah, this film in many ways surprised me, especially that opening sequence, which I guess we'll deep dive in a second. At a high level, I was impressed for something like you said, like for a director that's newer on the scene. Obviously, the budget, this person obviously clearly didn't have the budget constraints of other filmmakers that we've covered in the past. But, for any new director, it's always a challenge. And I was impressed, and I genuinely enjoyed this film throughout. And I think there was a lot of interesting themes and concepts and even stylistic choices he made that I think has really, in a time where a lot of movies are cookie cutter, have really what's the term I'm looking for? Have really was definitely a curveball, a different taste and flavor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. So we'll just give a little bit of a broad overview. So this movie essentially deals with this secret organization that is that essentially is a company that are a bunch of assassins, and what they do is they have one main assassin in there but it's not in the traditional sense where they go out and kill somebody. What they end up doing is they identify someone who's close to their intended target to take out. They follow that person's sort of movements and mannerisms, and what they end up doing is they kidnap that said person when no one notices, and they put a device embedded in their brain, which then allows their assassin to control their body remotely. And then at that point, since they have control of the body, then they can take out their intended target, leaving essentially no trace of that organization or the actual assassin. So it's a bit of mind control. And this film was interesting in many ways, especially in the concept. And so what ends up happening is that there's this main character. Her name's, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Her name's Tasia. And so she's the main assassin. And what ends up happening is that you are immediately thrown in the opening scene to one of the characters. Her name is Holly. And so Holly is a waitress in there, and it's not known to the viewer initially, but she is actually being controlled by Tasia, right? So it's essentially Holly's body, but it's Tasia is controlling her brain. And Holly is a waitress, and so in the initial scene, she is walking up to the bar, which is a very sort of rich and upper-class bar, and Holly is, I'm going to say Tasia controlling Holly, is looking for her intended target, and she's told that she needs to take out the target by shooting him. But for some reason, unbeknownst to the viewer at that moment, Tasia decides to take a knife and stab the victim. And it's not just stab in the traditional way. It is a brutal kill where and this film is absolutely incredibly gory at times. And so she stabs the victim brutally, and everyone leaves. And essentially what Tasia has to do in order to bring herself back to her normal self is kill Holly and say, "Bring me out." Except she can't pull the trigger for some odd reason, and waits for the police to kill her in a shootout, and then tells the victims then tells her controller, who will later be identified, I believe, as Girder, to pull her out. And that happens, and that's how you're introduced with essentially the first kill. And later on, what ends up happening is you're sort of it's broken down to the viewer as to like how this concept works, how they mount, and then how essentially after each assassination, Girder has to have a psychological evaluation with Tasia, where they have a bunch of objects, and Tasia has to identify with Girder what the relationship of those objects are to her. To sort of, because it's weird because you have all these memories of Tasia has all these memories of each person that she has taken over for her assassinations, and they want to try to make sure that Tasia knows what is her actual life and her experiences versus the experiences of the people that she has taken over. And so a lot of the times these moments get blurred within in Tasia's mind, so that they go through these protocols to try to sort of separate those two realities out. And so what ends up happening is for the remainder of the film is that they have a big target that they need to take out, which is the head of the CEO of this company, and as well as his daughter. And who hires them is essentially the son who wants to take over the company. And as part of the payment, they would this company would get, I think it's like 20% of that company from the son who would then take over. And so they identified that the target that they would want to sort of take over to carry out the assassinations is the CEO's daughter's boyfriend, who is essentially a drug dealer, and who the daughter essentially gets the drug dealer a low-end job at the company, low level. And so Tasia goes and essentially stalks this dude, trying to profile him, all of his mannerisms, trying to see, you know, what habits, what type of language, and you see her essentially looking at and listening to the conversations, trying to see, okay, like what kind of lingo does he use? What type of mannerisms does he? Because you don't want to take over this person and act completely different, because then they might throw red flags as to like something's not right here. And so they identify, and then at a certain point, Tasia's like, all right, I essentially have an idea. I'm ready to become this person. So then they kidnap him, embed the device, and Tasia takes over. And so the remainder of the movie is essentially Tasia controlling. Do you remember what the boyfriend's name is off the top?
Colin?
Yeah, I believe it's Colin. Yeah, Tasia controls Colin.
I remember that because he has like I remember him having like the easiest name to remember.
Right, out of all of them.
Because I was like, Girder, Tasia. I was like, what is this?
Right. So Tasia controls Colin at that point, and essentially there's quite a few interactions that happen, but she ends up killing, or one of the main things is that Girder tells him that she needs to break up with, there's a big party, and that was the night that she's supposed to carry out the assassinations through Colin by proxy. And at one point, Girder's like, all right, what you need to do is you need to make a big scene, act drunk, and sort of essentially break up and cause a big scene, and then come back and kill both of them. And so that ends up happening, and Tasia comes back in the body of Colin and just brutally kills the CEO, and then shoots his girlfriend. And they both.
Slight correction. I think it's noted later that like he actually has survived with the eye patch. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's right. So brutally attacks, and it was meant to kill. You're correct. Brutally attacks the CEO, thinking like in the most graphic way possible. And you think that he's going to die, but somehow it doesn't seem possible, but he survives. And then he just repeatedly shoots the girlfriend. And at that point, the plan is to essentially have this be look like a murder-suicide. And so Tasia is supposed to kill Colin, but little by little, and it's sort of hinted that she is starting to lose control over over Colin. Colin's consciousness is starting to fight back, and she can't pull the trigger. And so she can't really kill herself in that way because she's starting to lose control of this person that she is taking over. And after many different sequences and events, essentially Girder sends someone to try to go and check up on Tasia, who's controlling Colin, check up on them in this apartment that she's hiding out. And what ends up happening is that there's a bunch of sort of electrical shocks, and they call it a recalibration. And so this person comes in and tries to recalibrate. I believe this person goes by Eddie, and recalibrates Tasia. And you are led to, at that point, essentially Colin is lying back in the bed. And you see that in between scenes that there's sort of, you see the consciousnesses of Tasia and Colin taking over. And at this point, it's clear that you see Colin's consciousness start to creep into this room in a very sort of creepy way, and essentially suffocates Tasia's consciousness and kills Tasia's consciousness. And in one of arguably the most like terrifying yet powerful scenes, Colin's consciousness rips off Tasia's consciousness face and puts it on him. And so you see this sort of distortion, and that sort of signifies Colin being able to see Tasia's memories through this distorted version. It was a really creepy, very well done scene to me. And so then you realize that Colin has begun to take control and take over. And so then Tasia is no longer in control. She's sort of, her consciousness is put in the backdrop. And you see Colin sort of take over and want to take revenge. And after many different sequences, what ends up happening is Colin finds the home of where Tasia lives and kills her husband, thinking that he is in on it. But the husband is essentially has no idea really what's going on, or we're made to believe that he has no idea what's going on. And then Tasia's son ends up slitting her throat, and Colin kills the son. And so then at that point we are led to realize that both Tasia says, "Pull me out," and then you hear Tasia's dying son echo the words, "Pull me out" as well, which at that point you realize that the son has been controlled, and you later find out that it's by Girder. And the movie ends essentially with them going through the psychological sort of recalibration, where Girder asks Tasia to identify all these objects. And at the end, the first time you see this scene, Girder asks her about this butterfly, and she's like, yeah, she's like, when I was a kid, I killed this butterfly, and it's one of the things that I regret immensely. But at the ending scene, when they're going through this psychological evaluation, essentially you're led to, or it's shown that Girder or Tasia has lost any empathy because she shows no remorse for killing this butterfly. And so that's I left out a couple scenes that we'll get to, but that's the main plot. It was a very interesting plot to me. So were there any specific scenes that stuck out to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things I do want to discuss in this episode.
Sure.
Going back to the beginning, I thought
the
opening scene was one of my favorites in this film. I thought like it really.
It's one of the best. It was one of the best opening scene of any film I think I've seen.
I had that shock factor because I wasn't expecting it. And also in that tight like opening sequence, I think now that I look back, I see that there's a lot of basically everything you need to know about the film in a sense happens in that sequence, right? Like
Yeah, absolutely.
The premise, with the Possessor concept, but even that nuance of like she didn't use the gun, she used a knife. So it gives up a little foreshadowing that, consciousness melding isn't so clear cut, right? Like she still killed the target, but it was in a very brutal way that almost speaks to the hosts.
I would say consciousness takeover isn't clear cut, and it's more of a melding aspect of the two consciousness.
Yeah, because she's able to execute the mission, but
she's not able to do it in the way that she's intended to.
Exactly, and it's because probably, like I said, the other consciousness had this deep resentment, right? It's played up in the beginning. I hinted at the beginning a little bit that like she's the outsider, she's the charity, the token African American case. And then even when she needs to get pulled out, right? The host, I'm gonna call it the host.
The host, yeah, that's a good way of identifying.
Doesn't want to die, she really doesn't want to maybe they feel strongly about suicide or whatever, and so she can't do it. This happens in multiple times throughout the movie too, actually. Especially when the host, it seems like, has a strong personality, like Collins does. And we'll get to the whole girlfriend thing later, because I think that whole theme and concept was interesting too. So that opening sequence, I think, to your point, is one of the better ones I've ever seen. Not just because of its shock factor, it's setting the
But
stage.
because there's a lot of foreshadowment there, and a lot that's just revealed.
Going back to my earlier point, everything you need to basically know about the film and what it's going to be about happens in that sequence. And I think you don't realize that until you end, and you're like, okay, a lot of things happen, and there's a lot of other like little scenes and stuff. But everything I want to know about, if you had to like basically sum up like the themes and what the movie's about, you can just.
That was a good summary right there.
Just watch the first scene, and there you go, right? And a lot of films struggle with that, right? They go through this long-winded expositions or a lot of detail, and at the end you're like, okay, I get it, but could you have done this more succinctly, right? Because with films,
this is about as succinct as you can get.
Yeah, with films, the trick is that unlike TV shows, there's just like TV shows, if you think about it, especially in our modern day streaming era, a lot of TV shows actually, to me, feel like 8-hour, 12-hour long films, right? With maybe like a part 1, a part 2, or maybe 3 parts, right? Like a part 1, 2, 3. Especially if you think of shows like, especially on the ones that are bingeable, right? Like Netflix shows or Hulu ones that release all at the same time, right? While traditional TV was more episodic. I think in movies you have an issue of like usually, and we've been doing a lot of movies, so we know that studios, the sweet spot is like that hour 45 to 2 hours and 10, right? That's like where they like it, ideally maybe a little bit under 2 hours. And so you're under these constraints, where I give the director a lot of credit and the screenplay, is that they're able to really disseminate that message clearly in the beginning, so you're not really confused later, and you're more interested about the storyline, the characters. And not many films can pull that off. So I tip my hat there. But yeah, I really like the opening scene. And I do want to get to the interesting relationship between Ava and Colin. But speaking of Girder and Tasha and the organization, I found it interesting how like even the concept of taking over somebody that's like close by, like it's like the oldest statistic you hear, right? Like murders and even like unfortunately sexual assaults always happen to people who are in the social circle, right? Because the person has a trust level factor of the other person, and then they don't expect to be abused or killed. And so it's all the like the movie, like I like how it doesn't treat you like a moron, where it just assumes that you know this, so that when they say like, oh, we're taking over like the boyfriend or somebody who's like in the social circle of the victim, it's not a surprise to you. They don't have to explain. Like how some movies will over explain. They'll be like, oh yeah, because it just makes sense because statistics show blah blah blah. And it's like no, they just assume that the audience.
Well, what they do.
Movies. Sorry, I'll let you go in a sec. I like movies that don't treat the audience like dumb. Like, oh, they won't know this fact, so I should have an exposition about it. That's just wasted screenplay, right? So I like that fact, and so I'm interested to pick your brain a little bit about like how in many ways the story is very simplistic, but it moves in such a I don't want to say fast, but in such a seamless way that you're not like ever like bored or feeling like you're being talked to.
Yeah, I mean you're not. So there's so many themes that this film tries to sort of address with the concept, and that ends up happening a lot with science fiction films. I feel is that they're able to sort of use the backdrop of science fiction or this interesting concept to inject or like probe some more interesting concepts and really themes, right? So this like idea of like body control, are you ever really in control? I thought that it was just sort of really fascinating. I totally agree with you that they were very succinct within the opening scene, and that really is sort of like a microcosm of what the film is about, right? Like there's a very like if you had like a little quick summary where you read sort of the main details, that was a really good way of sort of introducing and really having like a 2-minute idea or like a sequence of like what you're going to be introduced to as the audience. And so I thought Cronenberg did a great job there. And I thought that. Sorry, what was your question with Ava and Colin?
No, that's a whole other thing I want to get to. My question is more about what did you think of like, that's something I noticed personally, that how like the themes, the premises was woven into the film.
Oh yeah, it was
versus many films that have to like give you like
overexpress
exposition and like text you have to read, or like I said, exposition to get you like
Yeah,
understanding like the framework.
I mean, there was a lot of subtlety with this film, I will say, and I do appreciate that. I'm sure, like if you listen to this podcast often, you've heard me say that. Like, I tend to not like films that are overly explicit and have a little subtlety. Even like the concept of the butterfly with the psychological debriefings after each assassination. That idea of like you're not sure quite what the butterfly represents until the end, and that's sort of showing that that her remorse for the butterfly is supposed to express or like symbolize her empathy, and when she shows no remorse for that, you realize, oh, she's gone through this personality or character shift. And so I think the film does a very good job at sort of guiding you through, not overly explaining everything, and yet weaving the story in a very clear way. I was very impressed by like the screenwriting and how Cronenberg chose to direct this film. There were a couple issues I had, but overall I thought it was very tight, very well put together film.
Yeah, I do agree. I'm when you're ready to go, another scene that I would like to discuss. I don't know if there's anything in the beginning you would like to discuss as well, but
no, it's just more interesting. I think so. One of the slower parts, but ends up being very important, is when you're first introduced to Tasia's family, that being her husband Michael, or estranged husband, right? Because their relationship's a little tenuous, and her son Ira. You really see, because you're led to believe that she wants to be with her family, and like at least that's what she tells Girder, and that she wants to have sort of her life back together to sort of decompress. But you see with her interactions with Michael, it's especially when they're at one point making love, she almost, you can feel that there's like no emotional connection there, and it's very interesting. But that later sort of foreshadows some of her decisions. Yeah, and you can see because she tells Michael the next day, "I need to head out," and he's like, "I thought you had a couple days left to like spend with your family before you needed to go back to work." She's like, "No, I need to leave. It's an important case." And at that point, you sort of see that she's sort of lost interest completely with her family.
Yeah, it's a slower scene, but it's like you said, it's set up for a bit later. It's supposed to. I think that scene like is supposed to kind of tell the viewer that. She is already, like, even before you get to the end, she's already in the process of going through her dehumanization process.
Yeah.
And because
you can see, and you're led, it's sort of just implied that after each assassination attempt, she's losing a little bit of herself, of her life, her past life.
Exactly. Yeah, and that is very that's one of the themes throughout the film. No, the scene I was gonna jump to was when we're introduced to Colin, when she's kind of possessed him, and he and then they have the
I know exactly what scene you're gonna jump to, but go ahead.
There is he first I found it interesting that Ava is able to pick up really quickly subconsciously that he's different because she knows him really well, right? She makes a couple remarks that you're like, I feel like you're just,
what's going on with you today? Yeah
like you were so different the other day, right?
Yeah.
So even though they do all this training on body language and profiles, like it's to be somebody else is like it's basically, I think the message of the film is that it's basically impossible. Yeah. You can do your really best, but somebody who really knows your body language, your kind of like your quirks, your real subtleties, you're not going to be able to replicate. But yeah, he goes to work. And I don't know if this was a critique of kind of like how our society does photo recognition and video recognition. But Colin works as basically the lowest level employee at like any social media company in a sense, or data company, where he's just there to identify certain objects as quickly as possible, right? So they have the categorization of these photos, so they can use it in their machine learning model, so they can propagate that, right? But in many,
in his case, it has to do with. Sorry to cut you off. Yeah,
he's doing with currents, but you see, he gets to a video where, well, first of all, this is where you're also. So this sequence actually, I give again, this is good creative screenplaying. It does two things, right? It's like still taking a critique of maybe this industry, but also still it's putting in the back of your mind that like Tasha doesn't have full control of the host, right? Because she's struggling. It's this sequence she's having a hard time like just getting him in like under control a little bit, right? There's that little what does he do? Like what does she like Colin do? Like a little eye flutter. Like there's some body language stuff that shows up in this sequence. But yeah, so he's categorizing curtains, and then first of all gets caught up with like your first instance of let's say a sexual scene where the man is pleasuring the woman with orally. They use all the proper terms. But what I found interesting is that again, it is well documented that a lot of people who work in this in our own society field who do the categorization of images and videos for especially like suspect things like beheadings or sexual assault and stuff, they actually end up with mental health issues. It's well documented. But also the camera turning on, right? People also are spooked out. Like Snowden is one that talked about this a lot. That like there's a reason why when you talk and your phones are near you, you'll still get ads in your search or Instagram for things that you discussed on the phone or or just like in general in the car, because the mic is in theory on like all the time. And what's interesting is that even when you switch devices, if you're using the same Google account, this has happened to me where I'm using like work and I'm checking my personal email for something, and I happen to Google search for something work related, right? Because I forgot to log out. I'll see an ad for that specific company in my Instagram feed. So there is a lot of cookies and integrations that happen behind the scenes that we're not aware of, and I think this is one of the reasons I know a lot of people disagree. Why I personally believe in the breaking up of some tech companies, but I found this scene to be nice because it did so many multifaceted things, right? It's progressed the story. It took a little, like I said, sci-fi critique of our extrapolating our own like society, and it got you thinking a little bit too about like not just the movie but bigger picture, right? And that's always a sign of a good movie. FYI for everybody. And so that scene I really like. I rewatched it. Like I didn't want to rewatch that like particular part, but I rewatched it a couple of times just because like it was that good. So I'm curious.
Pretty impactful.
What you thought?
I mean, so you have more experience on sort of behind the scenes as to like how sort of this image categorization occurs. But so you gave some good insights. I won't really comment there. In terms of like the impact that it has on you, yeah, I think it's one, they were definitely trying to include sort of a societal critique, but they also wanted to signify within that scene sort of the idea that she's really losing control. And you can clearly see it with a lot of the movements. One thing that I thought was interesting, and it's just more in his choice of directing, and I think that you'll probably see more of this as he continues to make more films, of that being Cronenberg, is just there were a lot of distorted images and sounds that he chose to use for the soundtrack that really was meant to sort of, I would say, confuse and disorient the viewer. At least that's how I felt when I was watching this. You feel sort of disoriented, I think is a good way of putting it. And I think that sort of symbolizing within that sort of distorted experience that you're not really sure who's in control at what moment, because it was sort of that constant battle between the two consciousnesses.
Yeah, the real quick, my take on that is that I thought it fit very well with the movie, and I didn't hold it against it. But when I was doing some extra reading and research, a lot of I think people who we forget in our society who are not able to enjoy this because like they get Olympic shocks and stuff, they did say like it's frustrating that there is no version or something that will help them enjoy a movie, right? And that speaks to probably how our society works, unfortunately, and discrimination laws where people who do want to enjoy these films are unable to because they will get an elliptic shock, which is bad. I thought that fit with the movie, like what he was trying to do. So I'm not only against the movie. I think it speaks to again like our society as a greater whole that we tend to forget about the marginalized in our society sometimes, and this happens throughout, whether disabilities or poverty.
Sure, I would agree with you. I would say that a lot of our laws tend to be written about what really affects the majority most of the time, but that's why we have certain discrimination laws. It's just in terms of art, it's really hard to sort of limit and make art accessible to I would say all audiences, because there's going to be some people you can't really, when you're trying to craft something and craft something unique and you have a specific direction, it's really hard to sort of tailor that. And if they didn't have those images, and you are trying to cater this film to, you know, who's going to be watching it, and that's going to be the majority of people who don't necessarily have epilepsy. You're going to want to craft your film in a specific way that's going to impact the most people possible, right? If you didn't, from our viewing experience, and I would say the majority, if you didn't include that scenes or went away from that vision, we might not have had the same reaction to this film.
Yeah, I think
and so that's what's hard.
And I think film is going to be one of the last things that gets resolved too, because look, let's be honest, like, you know, people with disabilities are having to sue Domino's because they can't even use their website or their app. So like, it's like low on the totem pole anyways. I just find it interesting because it's something that I just want to highlight because I don't usually think of that. And
I agree.
I came across it a few times on Reddit forums and other forums when just got, like, looking at this movie, which again doesn't come up often, right? Because not many films do what he's doing with this style. But also, I don't hear a lot of this, right? I imagine there's other movies too that we haven't even reviewed or discussed that are in the same bucket, and I can only imagine how frustrating it is because they probably are movie fans or they do want to enjoy it. So
sure.
It happened. Look, for me, like, I have motion sickness, so I couldn't even play Portal 2 because like I would play for 10 minutes and I start getting a massive headache. So I understand like the complaint. So the
no, I mean it's a completely understandable critique. It's unfortunately, with certain entertainment and art, it's just hard to, like, you're going to have affect certain groups in certain ways, no matter what. I mean, that's just what art and certain entertainment formats just do. If you're blind, it's going to be really hard to, you know, watch a movie, right? Because you just don't have that biological capability. It's going to be really hard to make something accessible to everybody all the time.
Yeah, I guess what I will say is that at least in my copy, was there a warning in the beginning? Because I will say
that I don't know, and if there wasn't, I'd have to go back and check it out. If there wasn't, then I do have an issue because you need to warn people with this film.
Yeah, so I think
especially people with epilepsy.
I will say that if there wasn't a warning, which I hope there was, I can't recall. I have to go back and check.
Because this is definitely
that's the only real, like, maybe like the more in the studio, not the filmmaker. That's more of the only real critique, I would say, because I think that is something that's underrated. I think there's a lot of films that there's no warning.
And they need to put a warning.
And I think it happens to people, and I think it's...
Because what really reminded me of is around Halloween time when they tend to have, like, these haunted houses. Specifically, I think there was a company that was partnered with Rob Zombie, who was like a heavy metal dude, known for his sort of, like, horror image in the 80s, who would put on these, like, houses that were like World of Terrors, where you'd walk through. It was kind of like, you know, the haunted house maze, but they would have the probing lights, strobe lights going on constantly. And man, would that disorient the heck out of you. But they won't put warnings for people with epilepsy and be like, you can't, like, you need to sign a waiver, or like, if you have epilepsy, do not walk through because it will trigger you. So they need, if this film didn't have that kind of warning, it definitely needs to.
Okay, so jumping back to the film, I thought so obviously I think, well, we're going to probably still talk about Tasha, but Tasha, but Colin and Ava, I found their dynamic to be like the
interesting.
Second, like probably second or third most interesting dynamic in this film because especially how it ends, right? Like basically how brutal
with them too. Yeah.
How brutal, well, possessed Colin goes at it. But you see that, like, even in the beginning, there is like this, even when like you know, like how like, remember how they have the friends over? Like, I'm jumping around, but you know how they have the friends over and how they talk to him and how even her dad talks to him. It's ironic because we just talked about something kind of similar the other day, but like how he's kind of dehumanized, demeaned, demasculated, right? It's like, if it's not her boyfriend's father, who is a CEO, who basically treats him like dirt and has him work at the lowest level job, it's even insinuated by her friends, even her to some degree. You know, it's, you know, I found like in this movie, it's almost like.
So you need to include something. So Colin is dating up in class. in terms of his class structure, right? He is a cocaine dealer. Like he's basically his girlfriend's dealer, and you could tell he probably doesn't come from like she's used to being in the upper echelon of the socioeconomic ladder, right? And now they're dating, and he's interacting in a world that he's just not familiar with. He didn't go to college, probably, I am assuming. And so he doesn't have that same level of education. So he's got no real skill set aside from dealing, right? And so he still does that, but she's trying to, his girlfriend is the one who's providing the opportunity for him, got him a job at her father's company. And because he doesn't have that education level, he can't relate to these people that are in her friend group. And they just treat, you could tell because he's not of their world, they kind of look down on him a lot. And that breeds a lot of resentment in him.
Yeah, and I think that and going back, like giving the film credit, in the beginning we're basically shown that the host can have an impact on the possessor's ability to do things, right? Mm-hmm. And look, even how he tried to kill I always remember the actor because he's like always in all these movies.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Just say the CEO.
The CEO, right? Sean. Yeah, oh wow, really? The same name as the actual actor? Are you kidding me?
Wait. I'm sorry. His name is John. John in this. Sean Bean plays. I should read it in the reverse. I'm sorry. CEO's name is John.
Yeah, I'm gonna just say Ava's father too. And he takes out. He survives, but he tries to take him out in a very brutal way, right? Like he takes out the eye.
He
takes I forgot what the metal tool he used, but like puts it in the mouth and
it's for the it's a tool that you use for the fireplace.
Yeah, to move the coals. Yeah. Breaks those. That was a brutal scene, by the way. Breaks those teeth, and I remember when I was watching the scene, I remember like the beginning. This is why again I give the film credit because it ties. That's what I do like that tie together.
Because he put the gun on the table.
Yeah, and the intent was clearly because it could have been a bullet and over, right? But no, the intent was to make him really suffer because he has been probably bullying him for like a while, right?
It wasn't just, but think of the sequence, and I find this interesting, is he put the gun on the table, and he waited for him to react first. It was almost like he wanted him to make the first move.
Yeah,
and then just unleash
get him desperate, right? Like get him to realize that this is his potential end, right? Because they often say like...
or maybe use it to justify like him killing him, because he moved for the gun. Yeah, it was a very interesting sequence.
Oh, interesting. To me, how I interpreted this sequence, maybe because I'm projecting, is like it's well documented that like people who are really high in social status, whether that's with wealth or prestige, it's really hard to stay humble and to stay kind of like not see yourself as the center of the universe. And this character clearly, I think, projects that.
Of course.
So I think he wanted to like you said, like here I'm gonna give you like a way, like it's not really a way out. I'm gonna see if you can squeal your way out of this, and he wasn't able to.
Yeah, and maybe it was to give him the idea that he might have a chance. I'm not sure. It was just very interesting.
And like they say, it's the hope that kills you, right?
Yeah.
So he doesn't.
But it didn't kill him.
It didn't kill him, right? He survived still,
but he'll probably never walk again.
Yeah, definitely not. But what was also interesting is that Ava like walks back. She had left the room and she comes back and then she runs for her life and he just pumps bullets in her,
like 8. Yeah, it was not just a shot. It was not like a claim. It was like I want to make sure you're dead. And it's interesting because that sort of speaks to. You later find out that essentially a lot of these kills are carried out because the host consciousness really basically she's the person who's taking over Tasia. She's feeding off of the host consciousness and really how they feel about that victim. That's why you find out in the beginning scene why she couldn't kill him with the gun is because this lawyer, basically the host is very angry. Has a genuine hatred and just really wants to take him out in the most brutal way possible. And that's what you find out with these. And where Colin's like, why did you kill the people in this way? He's like, and Tasia, as consciousness later tells Colin's consciousness, I didn't kill them, you did. meaning that this is really how you felt about them, how you really wanted to. I was just feeding off of that.
Yep. I think that's one of the bigger statements later in the film.
Oh yeah, that was a powerful sequence.
It builds up to that moment where they kind of tell you, but you already have the kind of like suspicion or really strong like you're pushed that direction with all the kills you do see, because that I think that scene was when it really clicked in my mind that like the host is still in many ways complicit. That's when I was just like, oh, that's because that wasn't just, like you said, one or two shots. Because I thought like, okay, you take the second bullet, oh, you thought you missed, but at one point he's just pumping.
yeah. And that goes to show, or that signifies that he had a lot of resentment towards his girlfriend.
Yeah, and I think that builds up in many years, many months, and it happens to, I think, a lot of like people in relationships. Yeah.
Well, you would think that they had a loving relationship, that because from the outsider's perspective, right? You think, they had a loving relationship. At least it seemed like it. She was the girlfriend. Ava was doing a lot. She got Colin a job at her father's company, telling her like, I love you, and she even tells him, if you don't want to do this, like, you don't have to, right? You can quit. And so like she's understanding, but inside, like Colin, he's just bitter for, I guess, a lot of reasons. Part of it is probably because he's bitter that that she kind of like, in a way, talks down to him without even realizing that she's talking down to him.
Yeah, right? Also probably, I think that's definitely like for me.
I feel like Colin feels emasculated in this relationship.
I think the top two reason was first what you just said, and then second, she doesn't, in the party scene, you see that she doesn't really stand up for him. Just comply, bow your head. It's my dad. You have to do what he says, right? Like, obviously, like, I guess I'm getting older now, but like in relationships, you tend to ideally have like a partnership, right? Like, I'm not going to be a perfect person, but like, can you have my back? Because like, especially when it's like parents to child, right? Like, you're going to do your best, put your best foot forward, but you still want your partner not to be like, oh yeah, like, he is what he is, and like, he'll do it for like, he's fine. Like I settled, like it just felt like he felt like, oh, like you said, like degraded, like, oh, am I really like, am I really good enough? This is like, why doesn't she stand up for me? Like you said, maybe unconsciously or consciously he puts me down. The dad clearly does, but he's just, he already tells him like, I have my opinion of you, and that's not going to change, And it's it must be really tough, right? And this happens it's a movie, but this happens in real life. It's not like it's those are really dicey situations.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was that was a brutal sort of sequence. When she actually carries out those like assassination, or when he carries out those assassination attempts, and then the next sequence is like you realize that Tasha doesn't have full control because she can't pull the trigger. She literally can't, and that's when you realize, And what was interesting is throughout the days that Tasha is controlling Colin, that leading up to the party, Gerder occasionally checks in, being like, "You okay? Do you feel like have you like experienced any loss of control, anything like that?" And she continuously tells Gerder, "No, I'm fine. Nothing's going wrong. Everything's on plan." When in reality, it's not, because there's little snippets where you can tell she's losing control. And so what ends up happening is that she can't pull the trigger after, and that's when you realize she really does not have control of Colin as the host. And so there's a clear battle at that point. And at that point, Colin decides you're not sure who's in control, but whoever it is, Colin is essentially goes to the house of someone that he is having an affair with. It's one of Ava's friends. At least that's what I got from it, right?
Yeah, it was interesting. Again, I like the film.
You don't really know their specific dynamic.
Yeah, what's interesting?
It's really weird.
What's interesting is I think this happens after the brutal scene, but it kind of confirms what I was kind of suspecting when I was saying earlier that he was unhappy. Because what's interesting is that like he goes there because he's probably desperate.
But what I also didn't understand.
But there's a specific line that I found interesting, where she says like, "Oh, Ava knows, and she's fine, like she's over it.
She's cool with it."
Yeah, so it was.
That's why I was like, "What?"
So I wonder if like it was an affair at one point, and then it just got out, and then like she was just like cool with it or whatever. But
Or was it ever an affair? There's some people who are okay like sharing their partner, and that's why I like that was never clearly established.
that's true too. But what I found interesting, while you again like what kind of like put the nail in the coffin that this relationship was, like you said, from the outside a bit of a facade, is that Colin, the host Colin, must have deep down felt like he could trust this person,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't think he felt with that with Ava, right? Because if you go back, I do want to talk about that scene with like the whole possessor thing, but
Well, no, this happens after.
yeah,
That happens after.
yeah, but if you go back to the beginning where they have Ava and Colin have their possessed Colin, just to clarify, have their first sex scene. When I first saw that, I thought like, oh, it's just because they're trying to highlight that she doesn't have like this is like awkward, and like there's only so much
It was very awkward.
you can so much you can train, right? But now when I was thinking back, I was like, but is this scene also telling us that like things are also awkward between Ava and Colin?
Just in general.
Yeah. So
Well, I mean, it's got to be awkward dating your dealer, man. Just in general. I don't know. It's just such a weird relationship.
I meant, yeah, but I meant more on like that emotional, that like deeper.
Well, but I think that all ties into it.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right, where it does tie into it. But it's interesting how you can view a scene one time, and then as the movie progresses, you have a different lens potentially. Like I can see both interpretations, right? Like, okay, it's the possessor can't really control, like or can't is having issues with the control, but also that like maybe Colin and Ava aren't in like this romanticized place.
I think it's interesting, and I do. It's almost cliche in a way, because I feel like you see this in a lot of storylines, even like, say, Beauty and the Beast is one example. It's like there tends to be sort of that stereotype of like, a specific female that tries to think that she can change somebody. Like specifically, this dude he's a drug dealer. He has that lifestyle, right? And you can tell that she's just trying to change him and make him almost something that he's not in a way by legitimizing him. And I always find that interesting, specifically within this relationship. And maybe that's also what he resents, is that he's trying to like change. She's trying to change him and control him in a way.
So going back to that, because we jumped back, but like you said, he goes to this the person that he was having a potential affair or whatever, open relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's revealed that Girder put in a backup assistant.
But what ends up happening before then is that you're not sure what happens or who's in control at that point. But either way, possessed Colin kills, essentially shoots the girl or the person he was having an affair with, right? Shoots her and kills her. And then what ends up happening is Eddie comes in and was said that he's like a friend of her, and essentially that she called and asked him, said that he needed help, and then you realize how Eddie was in on this like all along as well.
Yeah, he's basically like the second agent to just be there for safety net. I think he describes himself as the safety net or something.
Yeah, and at that point, then he essentially tells Tashi, who's controlling Colin, that he's like, I'm going to recalibrate. He's like, you sort of lost control for a bit. We're going to recalibrate you, right? And so he brings out this device. It's kind of like you're not even sure. It's supposed to like send pulse sequences through the body to recalibrate. And so you think that so at this point, Colin is laying in the bed, and so is Ava's consciousness, like in parallel. But you see, essentially, in Ava's consciousness, that Colin's consciousness is creeping into the room, and Ava can't really do anything. And at that point, Colin is, and so you have basically reality as well as the consciousnesses. They're overlapped in sequence there. And it was, I thought that was one of the best scenes in this film, was when you see the sequence and then you hear Eddie talking to Colin and be like, all right, thinking that he's talking to Tasha's consciousness, like, is everything all right? Yeah, everything's good. But in reality, it's not. And you see Colin's consciousness come into the room, then get on top of Tasha's consciousness and essentially just strangle her and kill her. But what was weird is he basically just Tasia's face essentially just collapsed like a balloon, just structurally. And that was one of the creepiest, weirdest scenes ever. And then Colin's consciousness takes Tasia's essentially the face of Tasia's consciousness off and puts it over his head. And that's essentially the cover of the film. From the movie itself. Yeah. And you see him, and at that point, all of Tasia's memories are converging with Colin's memories. And you see it through this sort of distorted lens. I thought that was a super powerful, crazy movie, one that really stuck out. That was arguably the scene I think that stuck out the most for me in this film. I don't know what you thought about this sequence.
I thought it was an awesome scene. I don't know if it was my favorite scene in the movie, but I think it was kind of like basically my like, it's like a mini climax scene, right? Like you see everything that you were kind of like being shown and told throughout the movie kind of culminates in that scene. Mm-hmm. And then, like you said, it's like the ultimate, like again, I love I personally like movies that do show versus tell. And this scene just basically tells you or shows you, but with just the visuals that like, yeah, like this world of consciousness is very complicated, and like there is in a sense melding even when you do these possessor type activities. And this is where Colin does get the memories for what you earlier described as the final stretch of the film. And it's a very well done scene, and like I almost think the timing's good too, because you already have all these like there's you already see Colin physically, or possessed Colin physically having issues. You get all this like hints, insinuations, but this scene really just encapsulates that like everything that you've suspected throughout the movie is true, and that it's not just plug and play.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great scene.
So one other question I had was, do you think that it was just a total, like it was inevitable that Colin's consciousness was going to take over, or do you think Girder planned this?
I've read some of these thoughts on the film. I think it's too hard to just plan out, right? I do think Girder had malintent, and we'll get to that with my thoughts on that. But I think this movie does show that like Colin is not perfect. And he's, like I said, he's not from the same social class, but it does.
No, but I guess what I'm asking is, do you think that Girder sent Eddie in knowing this would happen, like that Colin's consciousness would take over, or do you think that So do you think the plan that Girder sent Eddie when was to have Tasia take control, or do you think Girder went in to make sure that do you think Girder sent Eddie in to have Colin's consciousness take over? Because you're meant to believe that whatever Eddie is performing, that recalibration is meant to bring Tasia back into control, or do you think that Girder knew that that machine was actually meant to have Colin's consciousness take over?
That's a good question, because I'll give you what my thought process was. Is that throughout the movie, it's kind of hinted subtly that they suspect that Tasia is losing control, right? So what's that doctor? What's that doctor's name that keeps like he actually makes a couple of harsh comments, or like next time pull the trigger. Next time just do your thing. What's wrong with you?
I can't remember the doctor's name, but I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, and so he makes some insinuations that like partly Tasia might be complicit in this.
Tasia.
Tasia might be complicit in her failing to fulfill the mission as intended, like with the killing of because it's clean, right? If the person commits a suicide, right? Can't talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
As an organization, that makes sense, right? But I think like my ending interpretation is that Girder is trying to build the perfect assassin.
Killing machine, basically.
Yeah, so continue to dehumanize her. So with the Eddie question, I don't have a clear answer, but to your point where I do think Girder is disingenuous, is that like, I think it would have been easier to take over Ava, to kill the CEO. And it would have been more reasonable, right? Because it's supposed to be a sibling rivalry, right? In the beginning, they say it's this brother's hiring us because they don't want the sister to, and her boyfriend to continue to have influence. Why couldn't it just been sibling squabble, I
think they also wanted to take out, so they could have taken over him, or him being Colin, or they could have taken over Ava. Either way. You still need to eliminate all three.
Exactly, but I think where I think to your point, like maybe Girder had some malintent. I think Colin was, people who have a lot of emotional, like let's say ups and downs and more
Mhm.
complicated personalities. Uh,
They're harder to control.
They're harder to control. So I almost think that you're right. That Girder, I don't know what the intent was with Eddie, but I think Girder definitely was trying to put her in a situation where, again,
I think the whole point
get her
was
closer to being the perfect assassin.
I think the whole point was to destroy all of Colin's reality there, to then have him be enraged to the fact that he would go and find Tasia's family with their memories merged, and then kill all of Tasia's family, which ends up happening. That's why, like, I think Girder in this whole thing is the mastermind.
Yeah, I do think she has her own. Yeah, it's like
she's manipulative. Because you're led to believe that she has Tasia's, or she comes off as if she has Tasia's best interest, but I don't think so.
I don't think so either. And I think it's one of those things where like she's clearly not like the head of this organization, but she's probably like senior management, and she has her own agendas, like any senior manager.
It's all about the company in the end for her.
Yeah, and so
so it was interesting. So yeah, that scene, and then I guess we can get to the final scene since the film is almost over at that point. When Colin essentially tracks down where Tasia's family lives.
Yeah.
So do you have any comments on this scene?
Yeah, what's interesting is that I was kind of like curious. So when I was watching it, I was like, so Colin is like really. It shows you why probably he was tough to possess, because he's conflicted, right? He might have had all this resentment, but at the same time, he didn't appreciate being possessed, and he didn't appreciate being now the face of all the murders. But at the same time, you could tell that maybe he didn't really want to kill. Like in general, right? Relationships are complicated. I like to say that a lot, right? Like even if you love somebody, it can be complicated, right? Or if you hate somebody, it's complicated, right? They do say that like the most boring thing in a relationship is to feel nothing. And I think maybe even deep down, Colin didn't really want to like take her out that way, even.
Well, I don't know, because I think that's just the feelings manifesting.
Yeah, but like he's partly possessed, right? I think it's like I think the whole.
I think he doesn't want to. No, I think he doesn't want to admit that's how he felt.
Potentially, yes, but I still think like I'm a person too, right? Like I think feeling something and acting on it, there is a leap, and why I think we treat it.
Sure, but all right. So basically, the way in which all these killings happen is that they use how the host feels as sort of the catalyst.
Right. But what I mean is that like I can feel something, right, and have it in my consciousness, but then to see it like actualized,
manifest,
it could have like a visceral effect, right? Like I think
it was brutal.
Yeah, some people might be like, oh, I really wanted to do this and it felt great. But I think with Colin, I think like you said, like maybe he doesn't want to admit it to himself or whatever. But I think besides that, he has enough conflicting motivation. Obviously, like he doesn't want to go to jail. Obviously, maybe he didn't really want it to go down like that. Well, he is what I'm saying is that I found it interesting that he was compelled to confront Tasia, and I think other characters might have been either trying to hide in a bunker or commit suicide. Yeah, so
you're talking about when Tasia and Colin's consciousness meet again, right? Where they talk it out.
Oh, I'm talking about like I'm talking about like in a broader, like just thematically, like of the film,
right?
Like Colin having a motivation, like
they do.
Go ahead.
No, I'll let you finish. Go ahead. Sorry.
Like characters have to have like strong motivations, and I found it interesting. I'm just making a point that I found it interesting that the script could have gone either way with this, right? Like, oh, I want to save my skin, or I want revenge, but they left it kind of like up in the air a little bit, like to leave it to your interpretation. What do you think is deep?
Yeah.
You probably had all.
And this is played out in this is played out like basically when Colin goes and kidnaps Michael, threatens to kill him, and then the consciousness meet again, where he's talking at Ava's consciousness. Yeah. You're like, why did this happen? Why did you take over? And basically Ava's consciousness, Tasia's consciousness reveals to him. So it's Tasia's consciousness and Colin's consciousness meet in their mind. And Tasia basically tells him, she's like, no, she's like, it wasn't me. And she's like, I'm not the reason. In reality, you're the one that killed them. Like, all those murders, they played out in that fashion. She's like, I might have killed them, but I was acting on your feelings towards them. And that's when he's sort of horrified at that reality. And that was interesting because you realize Colin sort of admits and realizes that truth, and that was so horrifying for him. That was a really powerful scene too. Basically, all of the scenes with the consciousnesses
were good scenes.
Were really good scenes.
Yeah, I think I think that was like definitely one of the messages of the film they wanted to iron in. I will still say it's like my own like opinion is that there is still a big difference between feeling something and doing something.
100%.
And I think that is where if I guess Colin was, like you said, taken aback because it's true he had to admit that he had those feelings, but he could have. If I was in that conversation, I would have counteracted like, but I didn't.
Yeah, I'm not saying that he acted on it, right? That he would have, of course not. But sometimes it's hard to confront how you truly feel, right? And that was the bitter pill for him to swallow.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times he can just be in denial, and I think that's how Colin was, or he just sucked it up, or just didn't want to admit that for so long.
And what's interesting is I actually saw him as the true, hero of the story because even though he dies, I'm
not sure.
Even though he dies,
I don't think there is a hero in this story.
Probably not, but I mean in the terms of more traditional structure, where like even though he dies, I guess you can say he dies with at least his conflicted humanity. Because I think what was very depressing in the end is that Tasha basically has become more and more like a machine. You know, like I will just comply.
I will say so. Those are two. You can say that's the split, right? It's kind of like the yin yang, where Colin still has his humanity, whereas Tasha does not.
Yeah. And then there's the girder aspect. I'm curious what you think of that, like little like. I don't know if it was a twist because I kind of saw it coming, but I figured that like the family would die, but
it was more the twist was that Girder possessed the son.
That was,
and that's where it went. Yeah, and it's led to believe that like at first that Girder did that to she really cared and saved Tasha. Really, she just wanted to save her best asset and something that she's been trying to groom for you don't know how long.
They often say that like the really best soldiers have no attachments to the outside world. So.
Yeah, and that was the whole thing. Any attachment that Tasha had to her previous life, gone. Yeah. And in a way, that's what made me believe that Girder planned that whole sequence out. Maybe not to play out exactly like that, but with that, the end intent.
Yeah.
Or the intended result is what I'm saying. So it was very interesting script. I was pretty impressed overall. I liked some of the director's choices in terms of trying to make, at least I felt disoriented a lot of times in this film. They touched a lot of like really interesting themes to me and made you really sort of question a lot of things throughout this film. So I'll give Brandon Cronenberg a lot of props here. I thought he did a tremendous job. There were a couple things that I didn't like. My biggest issue is that there were many. This film starts off with a brutal murder, right? It's not that he just stabbed them. It was a repeated stab. It was gory. And yeah, it was very graphic. And so you start off with that, and then there's a bit of a lull period where there's no graphicness. And then the next murders happen. It's just absolutely graphic again. So it was a little bit of graphic, a lot of disorienting, then graphic. I felt like there were too many. There was too much dead time in between the graphicness that it just became a little ridiculous, and it just wasn't consistent. To me, in that end, I don't even think a lot of the graphicness was necessarily that necessary, but he just wanted to include it to give the audience that kind of visceral reaction. I thought it was a little overdone at times.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say you just want to give your rating now, then I can jump in right after.
Yeah, so that was essentially my biggest critique with this film. I just like I got I guess a little annoyed with I guess the inconsistency of graphicness at times in this film. I either wanted it to be graphic sort of throughout the film, not just like with occasional pop-ups, or not as graphic with the film. So that was essentially my biggest critique. I thought the acting performances were phenomenal in this. But Gabrielle Graham, who was essentially the first victim in the opening scene that Tasha possessed, I thought she was phenomenal in that opening sequence, where she was the waitress. I thought she was great. I thought, and Andrea Riseborough, I don't think she gets enough credit in a lot of the films that she's been in. I thought she's tremendous as usual in this film, as being someone who's like plays an assassin who's becoming more and more detached from her humanity. And I thought Christopher Abbott, who played Colin, was just phenomenal as well. So overall, in my ratings, I'll give this film a 9. I thought there were a lot of positive things to this film that Cronenberg decided to do. Like I said, I praised the acting performances. A lot of the Cronenberg's direction in this film I thought was great. Yeah, and so that's where I'll leave it.
Yeah, for me personally, I'm coming in as an 8 out of 10. I agree with all your points around the graphic like killings and stuff of the
victims.
Like, I actually didn't mind it. I just felt like, you know, either I didn't think it was too much at times. I just thought it was like
I just thought the placement was inconsistent. It's either like if you're gonna make a film, like go all in or not.
Yeah, and
this is how I feel.
Exactly. It was inconsistent, and then also with the acting, I thought the performances were great. Actually, what surprised me was that Christopher Abbott, only time I've actually seen him is in the show Girls, which I haven't finished, but he plays like a way different type of character, and this was like completely different. So to his credit, that was interesting.
It's always crazy when you see an actor just go completely out of like the typical roles that they're usually known for. Yeah, exactly. The one I can always think of is, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the actor's name who died now, but the actor who played the Joker in The Dark Knight.
He played
complete role reversal. Yeah, thank you. Complete role reversal. It was amazing to see him in that role.
Yeah, so I was gonna say that it's pretty much that. Like the reason I'm probably a little bit lower is that I felt like this was a good film, solid. It's just that, you know, I always say the same thing. For me to be in that 9 range, it has to resonate with me, like just not just as a film, but at an emotional level. And like there was a lot of like I love discussing this film, but it's not a film where I go, you know, this film like spoke to me in levels that like I just can't even describe at times, you know. So it was a good, solid film. This is one of those films that like I would definitely watch again, and I really did enjoy it, and I have no qualms with it, really. I give a lot of credit, you know, to credit to do.
Yeah, I guess a last little tidbit. I mean, that's fair. The last little tidbit that I found interesting, and I was watching it, there's not a lot of interviews with the director on this film. I think it's because it came out during quarantine, and so that, you know, this year has been pretty weird. But back in February, he basically said that someone asked him like, what sort of inspired you for like the screenwriting of this film? He's like, actually, it was based. This sort of concept of mind control is based off a lot of neuroscience studies that were conducted in the 50s and 60s, where they essentially found out like certain parts of the brain, how to control them and how to like manipulate certain people's like grips and the hand movements. So it was pretty interesting. That was during a time when I would say science and biology was a lot less regulated in terms of ethics, and so they performed a lot. Some science that probably wouldn't be allowed to be performed today. And so that I found that sort of interesting, because during that period of the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of questionable things that went on within, I would say, psychology and the neuroscience community.
Yeah, that's an interesting tidbit. Yeah, I think that's very fascinating. Yeah, I think with interviews with COVID, it's been down because there's just virtual. Yeah. That's it.
And that sort of touches upon sort of this idea of like lack of ethics, specifically within science. That's going to be another thing that's touched upon in the film that we will be reviewing in the future shortly. I think you know which film I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I know that. Yeah, I just finished it actually yesterday, recently.
Exactly. So that's a little snippet. Anyway, do you have any other final thoughts on this film?
No, like I think this film was really solid. It was good. It was a good change of pace, and I actually, the one thing I really like about this film, and I said this in the beginning, is it ties in together, and scenes that were in the beginning, they're set up for later, and also just like, again, I love when movies show, don't tell. Mm-hmm. I know some movies have to have exposition, but sometimes I think they overdo it. So I appreciate that fact, and I look forward to watching more films by the director. So.
Yeah, we'll see what he has in the future.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, that's it for this week's episode of the Critical Fools podcast. If you liked our commentary, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for future episodes. But for this episode, we're done, so we'll see you next week.